Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for a very special edition of our AI Talks, a Patrick J. McGovern Foundation live stream series that's engaging the civil society and nonprofit champions who are representing our human interests in a digital and AI-driven world. My name is Yolanda Bacci-Lodovico, and I'm the storytelling and advocacy lead here at the Foundation. And it's my great pleasure to introduce today's guest. Today's episode will feature a conversation with the author of Digitally Invisible: How the Internet is Creating the New Underclass. The book has been described as a phenomenal must-read, critically important, and a timely revelation about technology's erasure of certain communities. PJMF President Vilas Dhar, who will be hosting the conversation today, described it as an authentic and powerfully compassionate narrative that amplifies the voices of people across America with shared interests in a just digital future. So without further ado, I'm thrilled to introduce our exceptional guest, Dr. Nicol Turner Lee. Dr. Nicol Turner Lee writes at the intersection of technology, race, and social justice. She is a senior fellow and director of the Center for Technology Innovation at the Brookings Institution and the founder of the AI Equity Lab. A tech policy expert and storyteller, her work has appeared in the Washington Post and New York Times and on NBC, CNBC, NPR, and the PBS NewsHour. She has served as an advisor on technology policy issues for government agencies, including the National Academies of Sciences and the Federal Communications Commission. She received a PhD from Northwestern University and resides in Alexandria, Virginia. And for those of you who don't know him yet, Vilas Dhar is an inspiring voice of hope and engagement for an AI-enabled, human-centered future. As a philanthropist, technologist, and scholar, Vilas advocates for an equity-based approach to designing products and policies that create a more thriving, sustainable, and equitable world. He serves as president of the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation, as an advisor to multiple global institutions, including his recent appointment by Secretary General Antonio Guterres to the UN High-Level Advisory Body on Artificial Intelligence, and is the author of a widely viewed course on ethics in the age of generative AI in the world today. I hope you all enjoyed today's conversation. Over to you both.
Yolanda, thank you for that wonderful introduction. And Nicol, my dear friend, what a joy to be with you. My one regret is that we're not in the same room together. I think the volume of our shared laughter whenever we are together is infectious. We'll try to keep that on Zoom as well. Nicol, what a week for us to be chatting. You are in the middle of a book tour for this phenomenal work that you have committed so much of yourself to. I have been so delighted to be with you through the journey of creating it and now to watch as audiences around the country and around the world are not merely reading it. I think they are resonating with it. I think they are seeing within it the shadows of the very experiences that they have lived through their lives. And I'm excited for our conversation today to really explore what that looks like.
Well, thank you so much,
Please.
Vilas. Look, I got the book.
Love it.
I got the book.
It's so good. I remember the galley copies. I remember the unboxing. And now I see people all across the internet posting pictures of themselves with the book, sometimes with you and sometimes with communities where they are reading it together. What an incredible journey. Nicol, I know that in the book you reference one of my favorite quotes from James Baldwin. You reference a quote that not everything that can be faced can be changed. But essentially, to change anything, we have to start by facing it. And I'd love for you to start by just sharing with us a little bit of your personal journey. As you talk about the themes that will emerge in the book and as we go through our discussion, ground us in your own experience growing up in America. What is your experience of digital infrastructure, of personal autonomy and sovereignty, of dignity in this world look like?
Well, first and foremost, my friend, thank you, thank you, thank you. I am so humbled by, not just the role that you play in the space as a pioneer, as a vanguard leader, but I'm humbled by our friendship. So I want to make sure you hear that from me often, because I think I remember many conversations, just you inspiring and motivating me to do this work. And I want to say to all of you, it does take that motivation to really change the world. And if you are in that business, you know how hard it is. And it's good to have great people like Vilas on your side. With that being the case, it's so interesting. I'm telling everybody, yes, you are going to find out my real age when you read this book, because I go all the way back to the 1990s. Okay. So if you were trying to figure it out, yes, I have been around for quite some time, but like wine and fine wine, we just don't age. Listen, I tell people when I think about this experience of this book and what I'm talking about, I think about when I was a young person. I was actually talking about this the other day with someone about the word processor and the typewriter and how important those tools were back in the days when you needed to get a job. And to become, at that time as a high school student, just an admin was a step up from working in the mall behind the register. And for me, when I go back and I reflect on things like the 386 computer, being able to connect to an Ethernet connection through the wall, where you heard that screeching sound, if you remember, and then it said, "You got mail." Of course, I'm not going to date you, Vilas, like myself. Okay, I'm just telling you, right? But the thing is, that allowed me to understand at that time just how important technology was. And for those of you listening, being in this space where technology has rapidly advanced and evolved is something that we all are living in right now. And when you talk about an experience, when I was growing up, we went outside. We got our news through local newspapers. We found this internet actually evolve. And I remember actually using the first internet in college, and we didn't quite understand it. And you fast forward to today, it's a necessity. It's no longer a privilege. It's not something that's resigned to college students, right? It's really something that you need to live, learn, and earn.
It's an incredible story, Nicole. And I know that you and I have talked about this a lot, and I've shared with you my sort of growing up in rural Illinois. My mother, who is such an inspirational figure in my life, who came to the US, and her first job as an immigrant was working at a Kmart as a retail associate. And for her, how powerful it was to be on exactly that 286, 386 machine, to learn LaTeX, and to then become somebody who could get a job as an administrative assistant and begin to
Yes.
step up, right? She retired a few years ago as the assistant to the chancellor of the university. It's a story of kind of personal growth because of her own ambition and inspiration, but tech played such a key role in that. But too often, we ascribe the benefits to the technology rather than to the curiosity and the resilience. And this piece that I know you and I connect to, tech was never dropped into the laps of immigrant or underrepresented communities. We had to go and find it. You talk in the book about the digitally invisible, the people who didn't have those paths of access, didn't have the ability to go out and engage, and so were lost sometimes in the conversation. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I love the way you talk about your mom, right? Because I also attribute a lot of this imagination that I have to my mom and my dad, who passed a few years ago. And I think about what you say, right? Because when I was starting in this space as a sociologist, as a graduate student, I talk about this in the book, I was really curious just about people and their communities.
Yeah.
And so when I popped into Chicago, I'll tell you actually a true story. It was weird to me because I come from a very large extended family that I had no relatives in Chicago. So I found myself, meeting this man in the parking lot who was talking about having a computer lab, and the rest is history. For me, being involved with people was most important. That's like my lifeblood to this day. I need to be around people to thrive, right? And so when I started in this space, I didn't really know that many people, unlike myself, who had been in college and graduate school, didn't know about the internet. I mean, in all seriousness, right? I had went into this like 300 square foot space where somebody had put a few computers. I came as a volunteer, and I talk about it in the book. And I found people who were basically just screaming for visibility in this space. Whether it was young people who were like, "Hey, I want to use this DVD or the CD-ROM to come onto this game." Yes, there were games on CD-ROMs, people, unlike my son who games and eats up all the internet in the house, right? Or people who are applying for jobs, who were like, the only way that I could apply for a job is actually going online. I wasn't even a doctor at the time. They used to call me kiddo, Nick, what do we do to get online? For me, that fascination started there with the digital divide. And I think, Larry Irving, who I came to know as a researcher, basically said that there's this have and have not dichotomy, people who have access and people who do not. And that was really on the shoulders of President Clinton and Vice President Gore back in the 90s. You fast forward to today, and to your point, I didn't realize that I was going to be dealing with the same issue almost 30 years later.
Yeah.
I write about in the book, a story of a young girl whose name is, obviously been changed, but she's always coming to the lab at late hours and have stuff to do. And we had gotten this Encarta CD, which was like the encyclopedia on digital CDs, right? And I sat there and did her homework, which I always did. They called me the computer lady, as a matter of fact. But the thing that I realized, that was the homework gap in the making.
Yeah.
And our friend, Jessica Rosenwasser came and later gave it a name. But to your point, I call people digitally invisible because I think we've been talking about the digital divide way too long. When the pandemic hit, all of a sudden, people like myself who were like at the prom and nobody wanted to dance with us, all of a sudden learned that there's a digital divide. But to me, the people we're talking about today are digitally invisible.
Yeah.
They've been invisible historically. They've been systematically excluded from the social mobility options in our world. They are here, they're alive, they're walking among us, but yet we don't see them because we don't realize that they're not digital natives.
Yeah.
And so that's why I really went with that term, because I think when you stick with a term for 30 years, you do 30 years of the same stuff.
Yeah.
And, hopefully we'll talk a little bit about the excitement going into the new election. But my point there is like, we have to change the way we talk about it if we're going to actually apply different solutions.
Yeah. Yeah. Nicol, I mean, I'm with you 100%. I think you and I have spent a lot of time on this, but you might remember last year at the UN, we brought this new language, right? We talk about the digital divide, and it's become so easy to talk about it in a descriptive framework of statistics and qualitative measures of access and other things, right? But where's the language we need to acknowledge that it's a moral outrage, that we live in a world where we are so okay with the system that creates those haves and have-nots, as you described it, those who are connected and those who aren't sure, those who are digitally native and empowered, and those who are, as you put it, digitally invisible.
Yes.
Contour this problem for us a little bit more. Like, we know that the digitally invisible exist among us, but how big of a problem is this? What is the nature of it? And why is it that we're not talking about it, again, through this lens of moral outrage?
Well, I love the way you talk about moral outrage, because I call it shameful, right? I mean, 6 presidential administrations, it's Clinton, and we're still in the same area. And unfortunately, it has some partisanship to it, which doesn't make sense because tech should be a bipartisan issue, right? But to your point, how I contour it is by, demography, obviously. There are people who live, on the wrong side of equality and equity that are constantly bombarded with this persistence of systemic discrimination.
Yep.
And they live in segregated communities where having digital access is not necessarily the least of their concerns. Hear me again, it's not the least of their concerns, but it adds more complication to actually how they live their lives. But then the other thing that I found, and just for context, I went around the country before the pandemic and I decided I was going to actually go out there and do a tour. So I called it the Digital Divide Tour. I said, I'm going to visit places because here I am sitting in Washington, D.C., and I can actually pontificate the same way my peers do about this issue. Let's meet some real people. Geography is obviously another area which most people know. We call it the rural divide versus the urban divide. I kind of suggest in the book that it's a rural solution and an urban solution, that they're not actually competing interests. But what I also found out is that there are farmers that are in where I went, Garrett County, Maryland, just 3 hours outside of DC, that can see the last mile of connectivity from their farm. They cannot even order supplies to be productive in a very competitive world. And they're not necessarily people of color. They're white farmers, Amish farmers, Mennonite farmers that are actually struggling with the same concerns. A mechanic that I actually met, he had an issue when it came to ordering tires in his mechanic shop because he was still using books. He had a slither of internet connectivity come to him through my host, which was a local broadband provider. And as a result, he cut his productivity down to like 2 days versus 2 weeks for someone to get a tire. He told me it's like having the ice cream man come to your community and you have one flavor to choose from. And now I got about 3 or 4, right? Because I'm still in rural, right? I'm not going to have a whole gamut, but I'll have a couple at least to choose from. Yeah. That experience, I think for me, is what makes it so complicated, but also what makes it so special and moves it, Vilas, from being just a program that happens based on political will to something that we need to be doing, because at the end of the day, it is baked in our digital competitiveness. There's no way that we're going to keep up with AI and all these evolving technologies if we have people who are struggling just to get the basics.
Yeah. It's sticking with me, Nicol, and I don't know that anybody else has used this term, and you will know, but you sort of alluded to it, and I like this idea of the wrong side of the digital railroad tracks, right? This sense of a lack of access isn't just about access. It's about participation in all the things you mentioned, our economic opportunity, but also things like engaging in political discourse and being a part of a participatory democracy, of having the benefits of being able to forge your own identity in a digital world. These are not nice to haves anymore. These are fundamental constructs of what it means to be a citizen of the 21st century, at least for those who have, and they found incredible value because of it. But you talk about the problem, and we've shaped it a little bit in this conversation. And if you want to get deeper into it, of course, I encourage everybody to pick up a copy of the book. But let's talk now a little bit about, my favorite topic and yours too, right? Where are the sources of hope? I think about the balance, right? The digitally invisible, and then, of course, that incredibly powerful term, the hidden figures. Who are the hidden figures, both people and movements, that you see having the opportunity to change the contours of this problem for us?
I love that question because, I use that hidden figures concept a lot. For those of you less familiar, I was just struck by Katherine Johnson's story. It was a book and then it became a movie. She was a woman who was behind the scenes that averted so many, space disasters just based on her acute expertise when it came to mathematics and science. But yet we didn't recognize her until she was 96 years old. And, 4 years later, she passed, but she gave so much contribution as a hidden figure that no one saw. She was also digitally invisible, which is why I use that term. And I relate that oftentimes to myself as a woman of color in this space. Being digitally invisible, it's a real thing, right? And to your point, like, one of the reasons why I wanted to do the tour was to surface the people who were doing the work. They had the aspirations that many of us hold on this call around what I can do with technology to improve my quality of life. I call it in the book the digital divide as a social determinant of health. It is a social determinant of our well-being because, as you all know, when the pandemic hit, you could not schedule a vaccination, see your doctor, learn, work, and do all the things that actually contribute to your livelihood. So it is very, very critical, not just as a civil rights issue. It's actually a both and. With that being the case, I'll just point out some, marvelous people I met on the tour that I hope to bring to Brookings in September. So please come in September 5th. We're going to do an event featuring some of those folks. There was Kathy Trimble. She was a principal of a consolidated K through 12 school in a very rural Black community outside of Birmingham. When I first met her, she was a beneficiary of the Obama Connect Ed program. So every kid in that school, all 700, had a tablet. And I watched those kids with a tablet under one arm, high-fiving her with on their way out of the schoolhouse. And she was so excited about her ability to bring the world to Marion, Alabama, Perry County School District. She is a hidden figure because when the pandemic hit, she wrote me, and this is in the book, and she said, "Nick, these tablets are like books without paper, but I've called the state superintendent to try to do something about this." Yeah. And she was a champion in trying to get Wi-Fi enabled school buses to communities where kids live. And she's been a champion ever since. And you're going to meet her when she comes to DC. There were other people that I talk about in the book. Chris Wood, there was this politicization of rural, where rural was seen as something that were just, people supporting a particular guy who was in office a few years ago. Became more of a politicized issue versus something that is just something that we should all be wanting to do as the technology matures. But I met a young man from Stanton, Virginia, Chris Wood, LGBTQ guy, who was out there giving technology access so kids who were not outed before their families could be able to live in a world where they felt safe. People like that are the hidden figures and the heroes of this digital equity movement that we're in. And that's why, Vilas, I talk about this book. Yes, I want you to buy it. It's available wherever books are sold, right? Get it today. Please, please get it today. But I also want people to understand that this is a movement towards making this conversation commonplace. It's not something that should be seen outside of so many other verticals that we're concerned about. Like you said, voting, healthcare, employment, education. It is really an imperative that we get on board because, as you said also, Vilas, other countries are doing this. And I talk about this in the book. They've already taken on what I think is a pretty aggressive agenda to ensure that their residents are not left behind.
Yeah. There's such a strong theme here around two elements that you've just spoken to. One, the idea that this really is about individual entrepreneurship and leadership and such an opportunity for people to step forward in their families and their communities to lead on this. But let's also acknowledge the flip side of it. It shouldn't be their responsibility and certainly not their responsibility alone. One of the things that I've been so frustrated by, I know you've been so frustrated by, is when we talk about the digital divide, there's been a classical response to it. The answer is to lay more fiber. Let's use lots of federal money and get fiber out to communities. And let's acknowledge, obviously, that's a baseline and a starting point and something we should be talking about. But there's no way that can be the whole conversation, right? It's not just about connectivity. It's not just about devices. It's about something much more foundational. Tell us what you think. What does it take to get us to a place where we bridge not just a digital divide, but a fundamental reconception of digital dignity?
I love that. And I use like words like that, as well as this word called digital competitiveness,
Yes.
because in my international travels, I find that people are more ahead of us when it comes to people being able to access the technologies that are available to them. And we can talk a little bit more about AI, simply because the government has provided the right type of collaboration with industry and civil society. But more important, it's not just a nice to do, right? It's not a political program that gets tossed about whoever's in office, makes a decision on how much goodwill they want to put toward this issue. That's why I'm not using digital divide anymore, folks. I'm just telling you, I'm not using that word anymore, right? Because it does really suggest, well, we need to put more money and resources into supply and demand. Supply on the infrastructure side, demand in terms of getting more people connected by helping with affordability. Don't get me wrong. Those things are equally important, right? We do need technology. One of the things that we're doing under the President Biden and Vice President Harris administration is we've got the largest amount of money, $65 billion at start, which is probably now in the trillions when it comes to the investment in high-speed broadband infrastructure. Unfortunately, that's not even enough money to lay fiber, which is going to be a huge challenge as we go into the election, because we still need people connected if we're going to be the gold star among our global allies as well as, enemies when it comes to who runs and who controls, the standards and the talent that actually is part of this ecosystem. With that being said, some of our challenges as well when we define it as a digital divide is we stay put with grandfathered policies. And to your point, we don't ask civil society or these champions we spoke about to tell us what they need. I'm of the opinion that we should be having a conversation about universal service, not the program itself. Of course, that does need some reform. It was actually constituted under Reagan, if by chance nobody didn't know that, right? So I think we got a lot more work to do. The internet does not look the same. But my point is, we need to think about, what does universal access to communications look like?
Yeah.
And lead with that type of framework or principle that then allows us to come up with policies that work for people. I was just talking the other day with someone about this dream I've had for the last 20 years about a digital service corps. You all at the foundation have done that when it comes to training the next cohort of people that can help us engineer and innovate within government. We need the same type of cohort outside innovating within communities. But you don't get that when you actually rely upon one size fits all policies. And that's where I think, when I wrote the book, I really tried hard not to make this a policy book. I really did. I wanted my 80-year-old grandmother and aunt to read this. I'm not going to tell you no lie. And I wanted people to resonate with the stories of the people, but I also needed us to have a plan. Putting things to paper doesn't give us an exact plan of where we need to go.
But let's take that, Nicole, and let's go deeper on it, because you know me, like, I want to get a little wonky with you on policy, and I think this point you're making is so critical. Let's talk about it for a few minutes. It goes without saying that if you live in America today, and we'll keep it as an America-centered conversation, you have maybe not a fundamental right, but at least a social provision of electricity, right, of municipal or well water, of safe drinking water. We failed on that in a few places around the country, and we can come back and talk about that, but generally speaking, there's a shared social expectation that
Yes.
these things are available to you as a part and a privilege of being in America. Why don't we have that conversation about universal access? And if you want to speak to it, and without getting political about it, why aren't we hearing about it on the campaign trail? Why aren't we hearing
Yeah.
about it in legislative halls? Where is the blocker from a policy perspective to really consider the idea that digital access has to be a part of a bundle of core American services?
I love that question for a couple of reasons. So you're going to let me get wonky? I'm going to get wonky
Sure.
because I know those
Let's
folks
do
out
it.
here listening to us are here for it, right? First and foremost, we did have the opportunity under the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act under Biden and Harris to do something really special. Like I said, have $1 trillion investment in broadband infrastructure, but we also had the ability to have what was called the Affordable Connectivity Program, which was the ACP, which provided a discount that was way more than the Reagan subsidy for people to actually get online and to give people choice about what providers they wanted to use. Well, the lack of political will, the majority, in terms of decision making in Congress, killed that program before we were able to build out. And, I look at that as being something where supply could have worked with the right demand. And I also look at it as a disaster where we'll probably see a bubble blow up because we weren't able to get people the right resources to at least get online. We've known for years in research that once you give people the opportunity to get online, they will stay online and they will get other services. When I was in this space in the 1990s, it wasn't the parent buying the 386 computer, it was the grandparent, because grandparent knew that that was a new tool of the next century. And it's still the grandparents that are basically investing in low-income kids. My point is, we have to look at this differently. Now, I'm confident that what happened with the ACP prompted people like Senator Benny Lujan and others to start a review of the Universal Service Fund. But then I opened the newspaper the other day, well, actually not the newspaper, but the digital one, and I find out that the Universal Service Fund has a constitutional challenge, right, in the courts, because they find it to be unconstitutional when it comes to the provision of services. And if I can go a little further, come down my lane here, the Universal Service Fund was dying because most of the contributors to the fund were cable companies. And if you have been following consolidation, you pretty much know that they don't have the type of money that they gave when it came to the original inception of universal service, which was making sure people had access to emergency communications. Now, that's a mouthful. That's a lesson. It's in the book. You can find out more. We in this country have done this stuff before. I mean, I talk about the fact that what we're doing today would have not been possible had we not transitioned from analog to digital, or from analog to HD TV or LED. We've done a lot of transitions in this country. But the challenge is policymakers have not been able to find, I call it like a home for this stuff, right? It's been a reactive policymaking strategy, when in actuality, it should be something, and I just said this recently, it's not in the book, because a book takes a really long time to publish. And by the time it gets to the printer, you have other ideas you want to write about. So it may go on another book. But to your point, we should be thinking beyond the digital divide, really, and digitally invisible populations in terms of their individual community needs. And we should be contextualizing this. How do we translate what their individual needs are into a global or national strategy of change? And I think that comes with our constituents really prioritizing this issue. To your point, I've just recently found out that the presumptive vice presidential candidate, or soon to be vice president, in terms of the Democratic National Convention, will be focusing on the digital divide. I'm hoping he's going to get the book. If you know him, please tell him to go get the book, because I got an agenda for him. My point is, if he's going to be focusing on that, we don't need him to focus on getting more shiny objects to students in schools. We need to be talking about having sustainable funding for schools to be able to have that, creating an Office of Innovation in the Department of Education that looks at these concerns, as well as things like AI. We need to be having the Corporation for National Service, having a program called the Digital Service Corps, that people can be very deliberate about making sure there's people to help them get online for healthcare, employment, education. My point is, let's get this right now, because if we don't, rural electrification was a great movement, and I kind of critique it a little bit in the book, because only people who benefited were rural people, right? We need more people to be part of this movement, because when you think about it, no job is going to be online. Or inline, excuse me. Education will be harder to come by when it comes to getting young people to be equitably accessing distance learning and other forms of education. The train has left the station. And I hope we talk about AI, because at the end of the day, you cannot do AI if you don't have people who are connected.
So let's go there, Nicol. And we're coming to the end of our time. And I know we need to get you back out. You have more on the book trail to do. But I think there's about 20 questions I still want to ask you. But let me pick two. One of them is going to take us to right where you were leading us, right? We are living in a world where at the emergent frontier, we are doing all kinds of amazing new things in AI, in data, in emergent technologies like quantum and everything else. And yet we're building it on top of what I consider to be rickety foundations, right? We're building AI on top of data that doesn't yet represent all of us. We're building data on top of digital infrastructure that doesn't include all of us. You talk about this in the book, and I know that you and I talk about it a lot. What are we going to do here? And give us a context to how you see the AI era. How are we going to succeed in it if we don't fix these fundamental deep fissures in the foundations? Do we have a path forward?
Yeah, I think the path forward is we've got to be aggressive and mandating or finding ways where we fund, local communities in partnership with churches and industry to just get this right? We have enough political will, at least from the majority of folks who are starting to recognize that this is an issue. I want to remind Republicans that their rural constituents are struggling right now. We have to do this right. So I do think we have to start, like you said, with as my mom used to say, a house built on sand is just going to continue to sink the more you put on it. I'm out here playing Jenga, the game. And guess what? The weaker the foundation, the more it's going to fall and you're going to lose, right? At the end of the day, we will lose if we don't address this imperative. But to your point, it's also important for us to not lead this into an AI divide, which I'm very concerned about. You know, here at Brookings, we're working on our AI Equity Lab, funded by the foundation, which is really thinking through how do you look at high risk areas and you bring together the right people to address both the trauma or the potential harms that come out of those models when you're talking about credit eligibility for home ownership or AI models who are determining your healthcare status. But then how do you also bring the aspirations and imagination of people who understand, who are close to those technologies? And I'm really excited we're doing that in healthcare, criminal justice, employment, education, you name it. We are sitting at the table with people who work in the space alongside technologists and others to really promote this interdisciplinary approach. With that being said, it becomes harder and harder for us to do this if we don't knit together what this framework looks like. You know, because I was thinking about this the other day. I think one of the reasons we might have these disparate connects, and let's talk about this one day when we're sitting down, sort of chillaxing and just thinking and pontificating about how to change the world. Silicon Valley may be somewhat removed from the telecom space.
Mm-hmm.
They were sort of like the telecom folks are probably now in their 30s and 40s. And Silicon Valley, who's come out with AI, may be more in their 20s. And I think there might be a disconnect between how we're actually part of the same family. And so, yeah, it's been dawning on me. Perhaps it's not so much rejection of the digital divide in the AI space and vice versa, but perhaps there's not a cohesive conversation that happens among the verticals to make them know that they're interdependent. So that's something we should talk about, because I think that's going to help us get to that maturation in terms of policy.
Well, you know what, Nicole? I mean, that resonates deeply for me. I'm just back from meeting with high school students from around the world who came to London to engage in 3 weeks of study on science and education and STEM. And you know what I heard as I talked to these students, these incredible, brilliant minds? They all wanted to learn about the science and the tech and the engineering. And almost every single conversation they had, they would ask questions about why the world was the way it was, what it meant to do this work ethically, what it meant to do it responsibly. You know, I always find hope in our young people, in those who are coming to these domains, not because they're part of the homogenous way of thinking, but because they're asking and coming and questioning the fundamental precepts of dignity and equity. It's the perfect grounding for my last question to you, Nicole, which is you have put so much of yourself into this book. You brought so many of us into it, and now you've created something that the entire world can connect around a conversation. What do you hope people will do after reading this book? What are the tools that are in their toolkits? How do we take this from an incredible intellectual contribution and a book into the movement that we so desperately need in the world?
Well, that's a great question. And look, I'm looking for those hidden figures out there that want to be unhidden. I mean, honestly, wherever you are and you want to tell your story, I'm hoping to actually champion that in a couple of ways. One, as part of the Equity Lab, I'm building a repository. I want to know who you are. I want to know what you're working on in the space. And I want to know, in particular, not that you're working, you know, at some company making products and services, but I want to know that you're doing stuff that's going to make the world better when it comes to not allowing technology to erase certain communities and people. And that means you don't have to be a computer scientist. You can be somebody like you talked about, who's like me, a sociologist. You can be someone who sits on a farm, or it was in my book. I found out that in this really rural school, I kid you not, it was a 5-room school. I've never seen a 5-room school. I grew up in New York, but they were the top robotics team in the state of Maryland. Yeah. Go figure, right?
Amazing.
But this math teacher said, even though they were Amish and they couldn't use it at home, she was going to make sure when they were in the walls of that building that they were going to feel like superstars. You know, at the end of the day, it goes back to what you said. There's a policy agenda for sure, and it's outlined in my book. And I talk to Congress, state and local legislators all the time. Whoever wants to listen to me, I'm actually going to talk about it. But there is a policy agenda that we need to follow. I've watched it for 30 years. I've got some ideas. Come on and see me. But I also think there's a people agenda. And I want to shout out so many folks who are working in the space, not just on the technology side that I'm speaking about in the book, my first book, but who are working on AI to make it democratized and equal. You know who you are. And if I don't know you, I want to get to know you. We need to amplify, to your point, Vilas, these voices. That's what you do every day. And I love that about you. And I love that about the foundation. But most importantly, I think it's also important for the equity investors to get involved with this. Yeah. I think it's important for businesses who are now all tech I'm sorry to tell you, every aspect of your business operation is affected by tech. I think it's important for you to be a part of this conversation as well. We need an all hands on deck strategy so that we're not making this a social program. In a few years, we're going to have so many vacancies. We used to talk about this, right? In cybersecurity, in computing, in STEM related fields, but we're going to have a lot of people who need to work in warehouses. A lot of folks are going to have to string fiber. We're going to need a lot of folks who know how to use computers or manage robotics. We're going to need a workforce where they can touch and feel the technology. And unfortunately, there are folks out there today that just are not experiencing things that we're doing today. So, for me, it is a journey. It is a mission. It is a tireless mission, and one in which I will never, ever, fall back on, because at the end of the day, I keep remembering the people who helped me, who showed me how important it was to get on that 386 computer, update that RAM so that they could apply for a job. So let's do the same, you're going to make me cry, because every time I think about this book and the people, I just think about how they poured their hearts into me and how it's showing up here. I don't want my mascara to actually go down. So I'm going to move my book over my face, take off my glasses. But yeah, thank you for having me, because I think this is such an important conversation and it's for everybody.
Dr. Nicol Turner Lee, you are a visionary, you're an intellectual, you're a brilliant human being. You've created a conversation for us to have together, not just about what it means to be digitally invisible, but the pathway that we bring everybody into a world of dignity, of shared equity, of shared opportunity, of shared competitiveness. You're much more than that. You're an incredible friend. You're a kind and visionary person. And more than anything else, Nicol, I will say to you, you are to me a role model. I know to our entire team at the foundation, to my nieces and nephews, to young, underrepresented people across the country and across the planet, we all look to you to be our moral compass. Thank you so much for joining us. Everybody, Digitally Invisible, available at bookstores, anywhere books are sold, as Nicol said. Please pick up a copy and please engage at Brookings with the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation, with Nicol and with myself. We're here to be your partners in this work together. Nicol, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.